In modern culture, two concepts have forcibly divorced. We frequently treat truth and love as opposing ideals, on opposite ends of a spectrum. When you sever that connection, both concepts degrade. Truth, separated from love, becomes a rigid weapon used to batter opponents. Meanwhile, love, stripped of truth, dilutes into a blind, boundaryless tolerance where nothing is inherently right or wrong. This fracture isn't a uniquely modern problem. In the first century, the Apostle John addressed this exact crisis in a letter written to a church leader he called the elect lady. At just 13 verses, 2 John is one of the shortest texts in the Bible. John's premise in the letter cuts directly through our modern spectrum. He argues that truth and love are not a multiple-choice question. They are entirely inseparable. Forcing a choice between strict principles and showing compassion guarantees failing at both. To function at all, the early church needed a unified framework. John reconstructs this framework by defining his terms. In his writings, biblical truth is never presented as a static intellectual fact. It is an active, lived reality. He repeatedly calls it a walk. He applies the same action to love. While we often define love as an emotional state or a broad tolerance, John writes in verse 6, "And this is love, that we walk in strict obedience to his commands." This creates a direct theological formula. According to the apostle, love is the exact equivalent of obedience to the truth. Removing one negates the other. If you hold truth without love, it becomes stagnant. If you attempt love without truth, the entire structure dissolves. The conclusion for John's audience is absolute. If a believer is not walking in active obedience to the doctrine of Christ, their claim to love is completely void. John establishes this strict formula because of an immediate threat. Organized deceivers had infiltrated the region and were actively working to dismantle the early church. These deceivers were spreading a very specific doctrinal lie. They refused to acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in physical flesh. The danger here mirrors the warning given by Jesus in Matthew chapter 7. These deceivers do not announce themselves as enemies. They come as wolves in sheep's clothing, embedding themselves within the community. To identify them, Christ provided a forensic defense mechanism. Examine their fruits to determine their spiritual authenticity. John applies this test by checking if an individual actually continues in the teachings of Christ. This is where a false dichotomy becomes tactically dangerous. Is believers compromise the truth just to be welcoming to these deceivers? John states clearly that they become complicit in their wicked work. Conversely, in 1 John chapter 4, the apostle notes that whoever does not love does not know God. Abandoning love in the name of rigid doctrinal policing means losing your connection to God entirely. True spiritual discernment requires an intact framework. Dropping either truth or love strips the church of its defenses and leaves it vulnerable to deception. Ultimately, this theological tension is not solved by adopting a better philosophy. It is solved by a person. In John 1:14, the apostle explains the profound reality of the incarnation. The Word became flesh and dwelt among humanity. Jesus is the perfect physical embodiment of this tension, explicitly described as full of grace and truth. This is the definitive synthesis. Truth provides the firm boundaries for love. Love serves as the active expression of truth. They orbit each other continuously. This leaves a challenge for every believer regarding their own walk. Having an intellectual familiarity with biblical truth is entirely different from daily obedience in love. At the end of his letter, John expresses a desire to visit the church and talk face to face, noting that this balanced, obedient walk is what produces complete joy and unbroken community. To follow Christ requires rejecting the world's fatal split. Authentic faith only survives when truth and love remain inseparable.